And feel free to get started.
Okay, should I start?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome everyone to today's Cold War Studies seminar. My name is Djilas. I'm a professor of international law and international relations at the Balkan Studies Institute of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And I'm also a long-term visiting scholar at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Normally, the Cold War Studies seminars are chaired by Mark Kramer, the director of Cold War Studies at Harvard, but he had a conflicting appointment that came up at short notice. I'm glad to be hosting the seminar in his place. I will now briefly introduce today's main speaker and commentator. Elias-Bursac is a translator, teacher, and independent scholar. From 1972 to 1990, she lived in Zagreb, where she worked as a translator and coordinated American study abroad programs for Macalester College. She is an associate of the Davis Center and has served as a language teacher in Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian for Harvard's Department of Slavic Languages. Today's commentator, Miloš Rastović, is a scholar in residence, also he is a cultural outreach coordinator for the Serb National Federation. Ellen will speak for 30-35 minutes, drawing in part on an article she recently published, and Miloš will then offer a brief commentary. After that, I will take questions from the audience. If you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom or the chat feature on YouTube. All questions will be forwarded to me, and I will raise them with the speakers. Ellen, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, as Nadia said, this talk comes out of some archival research I was involved with in over several years. Because I was really interested in Harcourt Brace Jovanović's publishing during the Cold War of all sorts of literary work from ex-Yugoslavia, particularly Serbian and Montenegrin writers, but also writers from other parts of the country. And I contacted Drenka Willen, who was an editor for many years at Harcourt Brace, to ask her how I might gain access to the HBJ archive, because I wanted to learn about the correspondence between the publisher and the writers and some of the backstories. And she said that the archive was closed to the public except for a portion which Alex Djilas, Milovan Djilas' son, had arranged to have sent to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So I went to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and went through as many as I could manage of the many archival boxes that they have there to start this research project of looking at whatever I could find out about the publishing of writers from ex-Yugoslavia in the United States in English and in England, obviously, in parallel. And I found this incredible sort of treasure trove of material about Milovan Djilas's writings, and also these stories about what went on with the publishing of his books. And I'm just going to cover the first two books that he worked on. And I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here so that you can, I have to go, slideshow. These two books that you see on this image, the first one being The New Class, is one of his most famous books, but not by any means. That was only the first one of his that was published and in English, and then Conversations with Stalin, which I will focus on principally in the course of the talk. Briefly, I want to, now how do I go to the next, I see. A little bit of information about Milovan Djilas for anybody who might not know about him. These are his dates, 1911 to 1995, and just a very brief sketch of a few points from his biography that are pertinent to the things I'll be talking about. He was very active in the Yugoslav Communist Party between 1937, or even, I think, even earlier, and 1954. These 3 trips to the USSR are what he writes about in Conversations with Stalin. So I've put the years here. And then he, in the years right after Stalin's death, Stalin died in 1953, and right after his death, Djilas began publishing critical articles of the Yugoslav Communist Party and the system in Yugoslavia, 18 critical articles between October and January of 53, 54. He was then charged with revisionism, sent to prison. Meanwhile, the new class was being translated by someone, we don't know who. That's never been listed anywhere that I could find, and published by a publisher named Frederick Prager. In 61, he was released from prison, and Conversations with Stalin came out in 62 with Harcourt Brace and World, later Harcourt Brace Jovanovic. So the story with the Prager publication is very dramatic in that Djilas was in jail at the time that Prager arranged the translation and published it. And I have this information here on the screen for you, but what I want to tell you about is that there was quite a bit about him when he died in 94, going back to his publishing activities. And when he was interviewed about his beginnings, he said he started out working in intelligence work during the war, and he was heavily subsidized in his early years by the CIA, as was mentioned in the description of this lecture, that the government was actually funding books that queried communism. And he testified in hearings that his firm published 15 or 16 books at the suggestion of the CIA. But after those hearings, the CIA was actually prohibited by Congress from supporting publications in the United States because of the potential damage to the credibility and independence of the free press. And he left the press in 66. So that was his initial thing. And then the actual drama that went on with the publication was described in the archive that I worked at Stanford in a typewritten version of a text by somebody named A. Keller called Djilas and Dollars, that Djilas got in touch as soon as he was released from prison with Prager regarding payments of royalties, which in accordance with American law had accrued to a sum of $240,000. This was in 1961, I guess, or well, whenever he was released. Yeah, 61, he was released from jail. In the beginning, he got no response from Prager. Then his lawyer, a Dr. Kovacevic, interfered, and Prager's private secretary answered that Djilas had no claim on his book, The New Class, because he hadn't signed a contract. The secretary said, in accordance with US law, a contract has to be drawn up and signed. Since no such contract has been drawn up, Mr. Prager has no financial obligations toward Mr. Djilas. Now, as you see here, they published 3 million copies in a very short period of time. It really put Frederick Prager on the map. I mean, he opened up an office, hired 24 people in the West Village, and really went in much, much more adventuresome work as a publisher. But this was considered an outrageous act of theft on his part. And so the North American Newspaper Alliance stepped in, this is from this same article, and sent one of their representatives to Belgrade. Mr. Djilas told the representative that he would have signed such a contract if he had been in a position to do so. But I was in prison, he stated, and I wasn't even permitted to write my wife. And he said he would waive his rights to receive royalties, but he wished Prager, this is all from this article, to make Dr. Albert Schweitzer a gift of the money. And then Prager, when he was embattled, said that he would pay him something, though he'd been afraid somehow he was trying to weasel out of paying it, that the government would nationalize the money. So that was the reason that he gave for not doing it. William Jovanovic, who was actually also, his family roots were from from Serbia and Montenegro, but he was born and grew up in Colorado, was the president of Harcourt, Brace and World at the time, which later, when he was renamed Harcourt, Brace, Jovanovic, and he stepped in and championed Djilas and took on publishing Djilas. And Conversations with Stalin was the first, translated by Michael Petrovich, was the first book that of Djilas's which he published. And when he went in March of, I guess it was 61, to speak with Djilas when Djilas got out of jail, and they spent time discussing the three different books that Djilas had been writing while he was in jail. And then Djilas said that he was planning to write a memoir of his interactions with Stalin. And Jovanovic decided on publishing the memoir first because it was short and it was just a pithy, compelling book, and some of the other books that Djilas was working on required more work for the translation, and he decided he would go earliest with Conversations with Stalin. And word got out that he was working on this, and because he spoke to I think it was Sulzberger of the New York Times, somebody from the New York Times, and they published something about it, and somebody else had published about it. And so he was contacted by the Yugoslav consulate in New York and asked not to publish it. And then when he gave them copies of it, they said it could be dangerous for Djilas. And Vujica, the person he spoke with, Dragoljub Vujica, advised him to go to Belgrade to discuss the matter with the authorities. So he went to Belgrade in 1962 in the spring, in March. And at that point, now this is in early April. And so I also spent time at the Kennedy Library looking at interesting, relevant documents about Djilas and Jovanovic in the Kennedy Library here in Boston, convenient. I'm here in Boston, and found all kinds of really interesting materials. So George Kennan was the US ambassador to Yugoslavia at the time. And although Djilas had been someone that he had taken on as kind of an advisor earlier after Djilas got out of jail in 61, by 62, he, especially with this question of Conversations with Stalin, he was beginning to distance himself from Djilas. And you can see here his comment: "We see no useful purpose in meeting Jovanovic at the airport." This was Jovanovic coming to work things out with the authorities in Yugoslavia about publishing this book. And so he went conveniently off on a trip while Jovanovic was going to be there. And he explained that this was a private publishing company. It was their issue, what they published, and the US policy was not directly involved, and they must, so he's basically, and you'll see this in a minute and a few more quotes, trying to put the onus of this publication over on Jovanovic instead of helping Jovanovic with the process of getting in touch with authorities there. And you'll see here, you have this work, EMB, meaning embassy. All of these quotes from telegrams to the government are written in this truncated language that they use this kind of shorthand. So it's not that I wrote typos, I might have, but in this case, it's actually the way these telegrams are written. So I apologize if that's irritating. But here are some more telegrams coming from the US Embassy at the time. Press releases about the book furnished proof of his criminality, and publication therefore is a material, meaning that he was going to go to jail for just for the press releases that he had written this book about Conversations with Stalin, and that there was this assumption when Jovanovic came that he was coming to negotiate, that he would agree not to publish Conversations with Stalin if the Yugoslav authorities would not arrest Djilas, that he would make a trade sort of with them. And this statement is that the press releases about the book were enough proof of criminality that publication was immaterial. It didn't matter whether the book was published or not. Already they had enough to arrest him, There were allegations that it maybe the manuscript had been smuggled out of Yugoslavia illegally, though in fact it was sent by open mail, and indictment reportedly based on articles regarding Stalin in the book last month in Western newspapers. He's charged with revealing secrets damaging to Yugoslavia. Now, this was an interesting moment in 1962 because, of course, in 1948, there'd been the break with Stalin, between Tito and Stalin, and Yugoslavia had been managing on without a relationship with Russia for quite a long time. And then gradually, after Stalin's death with Khrushchev running this Soviet Union, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union were making overtures towards each other. And in fact, this got very dramatic in these years with Kennan in lots of things I haven't quoted here because obviously there's too much of them, but saying, balancing anything that the Soviet Union did to support Yugoslavia. He wanted the US doing something to support Yugoslavia. And he was very aware of anything that could antagonize the Soviets. And there are portraits of Khrushchev in this book, which perhaps Khrushchev, I don't know whether, who knows what it was they felt at the time was problematic about it. But in any case, Jovanovic went back to New York quite embittered. And in fact, I have Alex Djilas to thank for the fact that he communicated with Peter Jovanovic, which is William Jovanovic's son, who remembers that his father flew to Belgrade and the meeting didn't go well with Kennan. Kennan refused to even make a statement in support of your father, writing to Alex, to raise any objection to his treatment by the Yugoslav government. And he was so furious that, according to him, he said to Ambassador Kennan, "It's plain I made a mistake coming here. I would have been treated far better at, say, the Swedish or French embassies than by my own country." So he came back to the States, torn about what to do, and then decided to go ahead and publish Conversations with Stalin. And he'd had a date set in mid-May, but then he pushed that forward a week. And he sent out copies. I just found this very interesting to see, to every US senator, members of the cabinet, and President Kennedy with this letter. Any assistance you can render to the cause of this persecuted man whose case, I have to change this so I can't see, whose case as a writer is not unlike that of the Russian Pasternak, would be most valuable, I'm certain, not only to him, but to the free world. And 38 senators, or people that he sent the letter to, responded to thank him. Several of them, I've just quoted Goldwater and Dodd here, give their own comments. And McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor under Kennedy, responds actually in Kennedy's name. It's as if he's Kennedy's spokesperson. Kennedy did not personally respond to this. Since the Djilas case is essentially an internal Yugoslav problem and the conditions under which his trial was held are prescribed by Yugoslav law, there would not seem to be any basis for an official United States involvement in the affair. And that was the strategy that the government took in approaching how to deal with this ticklish issue, because they were, meanwhile, courting Yugoslavia as an important access point to Eastern Europe because it had more liberal views than the countries that were directly related to the Soviet bloc. Okay. And he was called to testify, William Jovanovic, before the Senate at a hearing known as Yugoslav Interference with a US book publisher. And anybody who's interested in this can find the entire transcript of that hearing online easily. It's readily available. You can read right through it. But so here is a senator named Mr. Sauerwein. Before you published this manuscript, do you recall efforts made to interfere with its publication, threats, and so forth? And Mr. Jovanovic is very diplomatic and says, you could say it was suggested to me that it would be well for me to withdraw publication of the book in view of the fact that I cared about the fate of Mr. Djilas. And he goes on to say, I don't think there's any, and Mr. Jovanovic, there's a great deal of testimony. I only took a few quotes from it, but I don't think there is any question that the publication of the book, or let us say the forthcoming publication of the book, were the cause of his trial. There is no question about that. So he accepts the fact that this book is being published is do. And his bitterness about the lack of support from the American government is expressed very clearly here. I don't think the American Congress or the American executive or the American press need regard Djilas as a political figure. And so the book came out, and it's really interesting to see in the foreword what Djilas writes about his approach. Now, this is the second book to come out in English, and the new class, which had come out just a few years before, is very much a political analysis of communism and the different ways that it functions. And he chose a much more personal approach in this book. So he says, the idea occurred to me to set apart my meetings with Stalin in a separate book to be published sooner and separately. However, I landed in jail, and it was not convenient for me while in prison to engage in that kind of activity because it could not but impinge on current political relations. So he obviously knew that that was going to be, he was readily doing so in his articles and other things anyway. Upon my release from prison in January of '61, only upon my release from prison did I return to my old idea. To be sure, this time, in view of changed conditions and the evolution of my own views, I had to approach this subject rather differently. For one thing, I now devoted greater attention to the psychological and the human aspects of these historical events. Now, I went through and reread Conversations with Stalin last week just to remind myself of the book, and I was really struck. But he's a very good writer, Djilas. He wrote fiction novels and so forth, and he's really remarkable in how he captures the personality of all the people around Stalin, including Stalin, but also Khrushchev and Beria and Molotov and the whole crew. And I thought, I've seen this somewhere before. So I remembered Armando Iannucci's film, The Death of Stalin, and I realized that he must have read Conversations with Stalin. I couldn't find anywhere actual statement by Armando Iannucci, but I did find two critics who say, is this portrayal of Stalin's inner circular accurate? One only needs to read Milovan Djilas, or authors that met Stalin and his collaborators, for example, Milovan Djilas, have stated the psychopathic manner and so forth. And I was just amused by that clearly, I mean, it has to be. I had to believe that was the case, that he was drawing on that. It's important to remember in thinking about what was going on in 1962 when this book came out, and then into 1963, that the Cuban Missile Crisis was on. There was a lot going on within the US government about most favored nations status, and because of, in part, the relationship with Cuba, and because of the non-aligned movement, which was seen by members of Congress as being pro-Soviet, that they were concerned about trade relations with communist countries. And in fact, in the course of the summer after this, after Jovanovich's testimony and into that fall of '62, there were, they believe they finalized this ban on trade with Yugoslavia, at least briefly, and that went through. And George Kennan was furious about this because he'd been working in this sort of fragile relationship with the American Congress and then Tito's government in order to maintain an open relationship with Yugoslavia for the United States' benefit of access to that part of the world. And he almost resigned. And then he decided not to resign because Tito had been talking about the possibility of coming to the United States since 1961 after Kennedy came in. And he thought that that would be a good thing. And he was going to be traveling to Brazil in his work with non-aligned nations, and that he would then come up to Washington and go around the United States and visit the United States. And then this kept getting put off. It was put off because of issues that had to do with the reading room at the embassy and the other consulates around Yugoslavia, with American newspapers being available, and the Yugoslav censorship organs unhappy about that. And then there were other issues that came up that slowed things down. And then, of course, there was the earthquake in Skopje in the summer of 1963, but then regardless, and there were all sorts of things that I read about in the archives that I was working in about the juggle between when the Soviets would provide aid to Yugoslavia for the earthquake and when the United States would provide aid, and getting there before the Soviets did, and all this. So this jockeying around Yugoslavia was a very active process. And but Tito came to Washington in October of 1963. And in fact, he was the last statesman to meet with President Kennedy alive. I mean, obviously nobody left him after he was alive, but he was the last statesman to meet with Kennedy. And there was a great deal of discussion about, in the lead up to that meeting on October 17th, 63, 1 month before the assassination, there was a great deal of discussion about whether Kennedy should bring up Djilas in the conversation. And he went back to that same policy we saw voiced by McGeorge Bundy, that this was a private company and so forth, and that it was inappropriate. But he was given some wording that he could use in a little document that was designed to give him guidance about what he might say if Tito said this, what he might say if Tito said that. So he was advised that he could say, "We are aware of this problem and convinced that it can be gradually reduced in scope and importance." This was an issue of, I think, censorship. The general evolution of Yugoslav internal policies towards greater freedom of choice for the individual in political and economic activities is important. So this is this one thing that he, after all this pressure by Congress, which was very actively trying to get him to intercede on Djilas's behalf, as is Yugoslavia's affirmation of its determination to follow its own independent policies and to avoid pursuing policies which are indistinguishable from those of the USSR and the Soviet bloc. So that was the wording. Who knows, I don't have the actual transcript of what was said at that meeting, but in any case, that was the guidance that JFK had for what he might say when he was meeting with Tito. And I will leave it at that and be happy to listen to Professor Rastovic and all the other things that people might ask.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And now I'm giving the floor to Miloš, who is currently scholar in residence in the Simon Lieberman Phenomenology Center, to give his comments on Ellen's presentation. The floor is yours, Miloš.
Thank you, Nadia. I'm grateful for your invitation. And I want to thank Dr. Bursac for a wonderful presentation and thank her for her translations, a valuable and complex text for every culture. Based on my own experience, I know how difficult task it is. I enjoy learning something new about ideological shadow which stands behind the publishing of the translations. Her presentation and paper reveals the connection between the private interest in translating and publishing and the public interest. Private interest is built through translator affinity to specific literary milieu. However, when it's used for ideological and political purposes, like during the Cold War, it sometimes gets a varied meaning. On the other hand, her paper subject is controversial because it acknowledges the connection between ideological agendas, personal aspirations, and ideas of translators, which often remain hidden from the public. In this context, the papers give us deeper insight into something that was not well known during the Cold War onward. It examines patronage and sponsorship as a central part of every literature translation project, combined with the political and ideological aspirations of the sponsor and overall societal environment. The paper used many prestigious archives, the Hoover Institution, the Vanguard Press at Columbia University, National University Library in Zagreb, and national security files held by archives at Kennedy Library. The list of archives is missing the Serbian archives and library in Belgrade, but Dr. Bursac in her introduction explained the problem with that. The valuable archives gave us a better insight into examining the connection among ideology, politics, business, private and public interest. Without those archives, it would be difficult to get a more profound knowledge about the backstories of the translation during the Cold War. The first question in the translation process is, what should be translated? Or what criteria and interests shape a sponsor to decide what piece should be translated? During the Cold War, the chosen pieces were the combination of interests of the Western ideology, politics, private interest, business perspective, and others. The criteria can be a high literature value of political dissident Milovan Djilas, who opposed the communist Tito regime in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Dr. Bursac chose a very important figure in the former Yugoslavia, Milovan Djilas. He was a part of the partisan movement and the Tito regime until 1954, after which he was jailed because he called for political reform and democratization of the former Yugoslavia. He was branded as a dissident. Matija Bečković, Serbian poet, says that Djilas was rebellious before Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov. After 1948, Tito broke with Stalin and the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia ceased to be part of Eastern Soviet bloc. Yugoslavia turned towards the West. It existed between the East and West during the Cold War, giving the former Yugoslavia more freedom than other Eastern Bloc countries. While open to the West, Yugoslavian writers were more translated into English. In public, the ideological reason for this prevailed. CIA sponsored the translation of Djilas' publication for ideological reason. As Francis Stoner Sanders said, quote, "Who better to fight the communists than a former communist?" End of quote. To show the totalitarian character of the communist regime, the main target of Djilas' book translation was Western intellectuals with anti-communist orientations. In this kind of cultural war, the cultural, including translation into English, was used against rivalry ideologies to accomplish the win position. Translation of Djilas' books and others were used as an effective soft power tool to attract public attention about non-democratic totalitarian communist regime. Or rather, it supported cultural affront in the West for the West in the name of freedom, defending the Cold War as, quote, a battle for man's mind, says Sanders. Additionally, Dr. Bursac, in a clear and pervasive way, explained how the personal affinity in translating books can create financial assets and develop a personal relationship with an author. Frederick Prager made $1 million selling Djilas' books while Djilas was in jail. This is an example of writer exploitation, used for profit, while the jail writers themselves got almost nothing. The relationship between Djilas and William Jovanovic, president of Harcourt, Brace and Wold, best explained how a personal relationship could cultivate big translation projects. Jovanovic was born and raised in the United States, but he has Serbian origin. He met Djilas' family, his wife, son Alexa, and his friends. He described his relationship with Djilas, quote, "Toward him, Djilas, I already felt a bond because he, like my father, was a Serb," end of quote. Helen Wolf from Pantheon House was also from the Balkans, from Macedonia, which strengthened the ties between two publishers, her and Jovanovic. Also, these ties by origin made easier translation and publication process. The formula is the same. With the same origin, they can better understand common culture and work efficiently. It was interesting to read from the archive how politics was involved in publishing the books. Jovanovic agitated the Kennedy administration to publish Djilas' book Conversation with Stalin in 1962. Based on the archives, Dr. Bursac gave us an excellent picture of communication and values of that time among all participants in the publication process and political environment, such as the US Congress, Senate, and representatives of the US administration, as well as the Yugoslav government, which opposed to publishing the Djilas books. She pointed out, quote, Djilas' position that he was at his most influential while writing his books in Belgrade, have them translated and published abroad, demonstrates the influence of translating literature during the Cold War, end of quote. Jovanovic wrote letters to the White House, to US House, Senate, and US government. In the archive was found that this subject was mentioned at the Kennedy-Tito meeting in 1963, but actually Kennedy, what we can read in the archive, he opposed to that. He didn't want to prioritize that because he wanted to have a good relationship with the Yugoslavia. The bond with Djilas incited Jovanovic to publish other famous writers from the former Yugoslavia, such as Danilo Kiš, Borislav Pekić, Dobrica Ćosić, Matija Bečković, and others. Dr. Bursac posed another great question, quote, would Jovanovic have developed such a commitment to literature translation and brought the Helena Kurt Wolf books in print into HBJ were it not for his friendship with Djilas? I would be interested to hear Dr. Bursac's perspective on this. Also, I want to say that another problem with what is occurs when translators and publishers delete parts from the original, like in the case that you mentioned in the paper, we don't discuss about that, about Miroslav Krleža, when Lenski erased 2 entire chapters. Apparently Krleža agreed with that. However, there is a case when the publisher deletes paragraphs and chapters without author's permission. Mihailo Pupin, Serbian-American scientist, inventor, and professor at Columbia University, won the Pulitzer Award for his book From Immigrant to Inventor in 1924. In the communist Yugoslavia, this book was translated into Serbian and got a new edition without chapters about Saint Sava, the founder of the Serbian Orthodox Church and the most important enlightener in the Serbian culture. This was one case how the opposed ideology can abuse the author's deed for its purpose. After every cultural war, the participants asked themselves, what was the goal? What did we accomplish? Is the goal to win in the cultural war or build civic virtues, something more human with high artistic values that will benefit future generations? In the wake of these events, the crucial question is whether Djilas remains valued as a writer or he will stay only for instant purposes of different ideologies. One thing is for sure, if the deeds have a high artistic value, it will survive the test of time despite all ideological and political obstacles. Dostoevsky's deeds survived the test of time, even was almost abandoned by the new Soviet government. Literary critics usually say that the deed survived 50 years after the author's death. The deed passed the test of time. We haven't reached that point with Djilas, who passed away in 1995. In these comments, I couldn't develop all ideas, but I hope that is a good starting point and that will be useful for further discussion. First of all, I think on personal relationship between translator, publisher, and author. And if Mr. Alex Djilas, son of Milovan Djilas, is here with us at this event, it will be precious to hear from him about his knowledge of that relationship. I would recommend everybody to read the paper of Dr. Bursac if there is a chance, because it offers a historical insight into cultural Cold War. This paper can be interesting not only among scholars, but also among the general audience. It is an important contribution to the history of the Cold War and an essential reference for historians, political scientists, and other academics. This paper incites the reader to rethink different aspects of the Cold War with a deepening understanding of the translations and publications. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adastovic. I'm going to have to ask you to go back and tell me again the first question that you were asking. I got deleting from the original and the goal of the cultural war, but there was a first question that I didn't catch.
Yes, that was, I will go back. One moment. Yes, you mentioned the great question, would Jovanović have developed such a commitment to literary translation and brought the Helen and Kurt Wolff books in print into HBJ, were it not for his friendship with Djilas?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, thank you very much for your careful reading of, can I respond, Nadia, or should I?
Yes, sure, Ellen, please. Thank you
Okay.
very much, Milos, for your commentary. It was great. And I'm giving the floor now to Ellen to respond, and I'm also going to collect questions from our audience. So please, Ellen, go ahead.
Well, the question of, I'm quite sure that if William Jovanović hadn't developed this powerful relationship with Milovan Djilas, that his commitment to literary translation would not have been as profound as it was. And I think that I say that because Djilas, being a writer living in Belgrade, was connected to many writers there and was recommending, I see this in their correspondence, recommending whom Djilas, Jovanović might publish, and then they would discuss the different writers and so forth. And it was true that the Kurt and Helen Wolff, when they came over from Pantheon Books into Harcourt Brace and began publishing, Helen Wolff had grown up in Macedonia, though her family wasn't actually Macedonian, they were British, I think, but she'd grown up in Macedonia because her father was working there. But also Drenka Willen is not a negligible person in this discussion. She came on board as an advisor and a translator to William Jovanović early on. She translated their correspondence between Djilas and Jovanović for years, and all those letters are in the archive in Stanford. And she ended up translating some of the books that they published, and she went on to take over the Helen and Kurt Wolff imprint within Harcourt Brace Jovanović when the others were not able to do it. So this created this interesting core of people from the Balkans, because Drenka was from Glina, unfortunately a town that just had a terrible earthquake. But she's from the Serbian part of Croatia, and she came into this project, and these three people who had these connections to the Balkans really gave a foundation to what happened with this incredible production line of publishing writers from ex-Yugoslavia, which has enriched all of us who work in the field. As far as deleting from the original, this refers to another part of the article that Dr. Dasovic was referencing, and an odd editor who felt it was fine to drop 2 chapters from the most important novel by the most important Croatian 20th century writer for various reasons that he had. But there are 2 issues here, I think, as a literary translator that I can say. First of all, I don't agree with dropping whole chapters of any book anywhere. But it is also true at a totally other end of the spectrum that American publishers, and this is certainly true of Drenka Willen and the Jovanović House, edit much more than European publishers do. So there is and anybody who has published in translation with an American publisher will know that American publishers do not suffer from an overweening, crushing respect for the author, that they mustn't say anything that might offend the author by saying, this chapter doesn't work very well, let's rewrite it together or something like that. That doesn't happen in Europe very often, whereas in the United States, it really does happen, probably more the rule than the exception. So editing is an interesting issue between European practice and the United States, but is it okay to drop 2 chapters from a novel? No, it's not okay. And as far as does Djilas remain valued? That's a good question. I looked at a lot to see what was in print of his work, and it's all out there now that you can go to ABE Books and or libraries. You can find his work readily available. He published a lot. I only spoke about his first 2 books in English, but he published novels and other social commentary and so forth on going ahead over the years, and they're all out there. But it is true that maybe perhaps with the Cold War really behind us, he might come back as a fiction writer with more interest, because he's a very fine writer. He's a very fine writer.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bursac. I have one more question, but I will leave for later, and I would like to hear if Mr. Alex Djilas is present to hear from him.
I cannot, may I ask, answer? I cannot see him among the panelists, so I don't know if he's watching us by Zoom or by YouTube. I cannot say at the moment, but he's not among the panelists. He didn't join us here, so. Well, I don't know, but let me continue with a few other questions. Ellen, I have two questions for you. You mentioned that you have used for your research documents from the Hoover Institution archives and the JFK Library in Boston. How reliable are the US sources? I think that I saw a few colleagues from Yugoslavia, from Russia, from former Yugoslavia, from Russia now, and other countries, researchers who might be interested to hear from you more about the sources. And in addition, did you get a chance to use archival materials from archives in former Yugoslavia, for example, in Belgrade or in Zagreb? My second question is connected more to the general confrontation during the Cold War. Do you think that translation of Yugoslav authors who were anti-Tito oriented in the West contributed in any way to the US government's approach to Yugoslavia? And if so, in which way? Thank you.
Sure. Well, we have only 10 minutes, so these are very good questions and I could talk longer about them. But so first of all, because I started out this project looking at translations, I was going to American libraries for the Hoover Institution because of this material that was there from Harcourt-Brace Jovanovic, and then the JFK Library because the editors who were publishing my article for the Translation and Interpreting Journal said, give us more political background on how the reception was of this translation in the United States. So I went to the Kennedy Library to see what I could find. As far as how reliable the Kennan telegrams are, I mean, they're the Kennan telegrams. Whatever they are, they are. At times, in some of the telegrams, Kennan will, in his descriptions, he'll talk about rumors that he has heard around Belgrade. And these rumors, like for example, journalists would come to Belgrade and talk with Djilas and then come to the US Embassy and tell Kennan that Djilas said this or Djilas said that. There is no way to corroborate whether that was indeed said or anything. These are just rumors that he picked up and was reporting back to the State Department, to Dean Rusk. But I can only, if I use those, all I can say is that they were some things that journalists alleged, and I can't state them as truth. But as far as the documents that I got from Harcourt-Brace Jovanovic, they're basically handwritten and hand-typed manuscripts of Milovan Djilas's, and then the editing marks on them by the editor at Harcourt-Brace Jovanovic. There was no room there for falsification of any time. It's just original publishing house documents. So I trusted those documents as far as certainly as being and certainly the photocopies of letters from members of the Congress who responded to Jovanovic sending them copies of the book and so forth. Those were all actually on letterhead of the United States government. As far as which libraries I used, I did use the Zagreb University Library for the Krleža archive, because that's the other part of my article, which I'm not talking about in this talk. It's about a Croatian writer who was also published by a left-wing press in New York in the 70s, and that his correspondence with the editor who was working with him is in the Zagreb Library, and that was very helpful. I didn't go to the Belgrade Library because I could have, but I wasn't researching Milovan Djilas per se. I was looking at the translations, and so that was the focus that I chose to pursue. It would be interesting as I plan to continue with this project in various ways. And if I do, then I will definitely come to Belgrade and see what is there. Very happily. I stay, when I'm in Belgrade, I stay right next door to the National Library, so it's easy to do. And I love it there. The second question, yes, so you may know that in Iowa City, there's an international writers workshop that is held, and all through the Cold War, it was seen as a tool by the US government to bring writers from all different parts of the world. And many writers that I know, quite a few of whom were critical in the 80s in particular, one of the ones that I was aware of, ended up there for a semester. So that's a very direct way that the US government supported writers from Yugoslavia, some of whom were explicitly anti-Tito, some of whom were. There was a range, but they brought writers there, and for a semester to spend involved with writing with other writers, and that was a government tool, that workshop, definitely. I don't, maybe that doesn't fully cover the subject, but I'm concerned about us with our time here.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. We do have another interesting question from Mr. Bernstein, asking, can you speak to where Djilas saw his own position in this cultural war that you referred to? From his books, there is no indication that he intended his books to be a prop for the American government, although perhaps he spoke on the topic in one of his letters. We have a few minutes, Ellen, you can answer.
Yeah, no, I think Djilas was writing because he wanted to write what he wrote. I don't think he was, especially certainly in case of conversations with Stalin, he was fresh out of jail, and he was compelled to get that down while he still had fresh memories of those conversations. I think, if I remember rightly, and I'm just talking off the top of my head now because I don't have the information right in front of me, but I believe that he had somebody named Felix Moro, is that his name, who was an agent. And when I say agent, that's the word I found, but I'm not sure what that refers to, but maybe literary agent, possibly, or who knows what other kind of agent. But anybody, somebody who was in Belgrade in the early, in the time when he was looking about where he might place a translation of the new class, and he'd seen something published by Prager, and he liked it, and he spoke with this guy Felix, and Felix got the manuscript out. There were various stories about how that manuscript got out of Belgrade, but I think that it was taken out. Maybe he was a report. I don't know. I don't remember. I had it somewhere in documents, but I forget. Anyway, that person got it to Prager, and Prager went into translating it and publishing it very quickly. Anyway,
Nadia, may I ask one last question?
Yes, sure. Sure,
Dr. Bursac, Milovan Djilas was very unusual dissident for me, because he stayed as a dissident in Yugoslavia, his home country. He didn't go out. Right. If he compared to other dissidents during the Cold War from Soviet Union, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and many others, they went to the West. And we know that the Yugoslav government took his passport in 1970, and they returned him in 1987. But before that, in 1968, he was a lecturer at Oxford University, Great Britain. He was here in the United States at Princeton University. And it's not clear for me that he doesn't want to go to the West, or nobody invited him.
Oh, I don't think it's that nobody invited him. I think that Jovanovic would have been happy to bring him over. I think it was, I don't know the answer to that. I've wondered about that actually myself, why he chose to stay in Serbia. And there was a lot I found in the correspondence about the difficulties of whether he could be paid his royalties or not. Then he was partially paid his royalties. And as I understood it, Jovanovic was holding on to his royalties in New York to be able to make them available to them if he needed them, or to provide the family with various forms of support. So, but I don't know why he chose. I've never seen anything specifically about that.
Thank you, Dr. Bursac.
I think that we can conclude our seminar. I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Bursac, for your fascinating talk. And thank you very much, Dr. Rastovic, for your thoughtful, great commentary. Thank you, all of you who have been watching us on YouTube and on Zoom. And I would like also to thank Danielle and Mary from the Davis Center for the great work they do behind the scenes. Thank you all, and all the best.